Today on Public Research.
Israel made a choice that it would give up strategic autonomy, strategic maneuver, in exchange for super advanced weapon systems and the diplomatic support internationally. I would argue that the 73 war's surprise was a strategic failure, not an intelligence failure. Yes, there was an intelligence failure, but the real failure was strategic, and it was anchored to that choice that Israel made. And instead of re-examining that choice, the Israeli military establishment has descended deeper and deeper and deeper into that paradigm of dependence.
Foreign policy specialist David Wurmser, Middle East advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney, and an expert in Israeli affairs, joins me to discuss the war in Gaza at 7 months, living through 9/11, and what it's like to be the subject of 2 decades of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. We are 7 months into the war. What would your letter grade be for Netanyahu in this operation?
I would probably give him a B-, because I think while he was operating under a tremendous amount of restraints, I believe the lack of decisiveness would have prevented some of these restraints from operating. Namely, it's very clear the United States from the beginning did not want Israel to really respond to this in an aggressive, paradigm-shifting way. They didn't want Israel even to go in on the ground, apparently, in October. But I think the indecisiveness of the government, in part because of these pressures, actually invited more pressures. And it made this more complex. So that's why I think Israel is muddling into the right place, but it's muddling into it rather than decisively, marching into it or decisively entering it.
Was it a mistake to wait this long to go into Rafah?
Yeah, I don't know all the calculations that happened all along, but one thing was very clear: the most understanding Israel was going to get was October 8th. Every day after that, it begins to fade. And my sense was, and this is perhaps more substantively a critique, I believe Israel should have done Rafah first. I was worried from day one about the hostages being pulled out of Gaza into the Sinai, into Iran. I was very worried about the resupply. Just generally, it was rather mystifying to me why Israel didn't first isolate Gaza from the rest of from Egypt and from the rest of the Middle East, and then slowly grind from the north and the south to the point where the two fronts meet, or however else they would do it. But to me, it was a mistake not doing Rafah, and specifically the Philadelphia corridor, the border salient between Egypt and Gaza. To me, I felt that was a mistake from day one, and it was clear to me then. So that was one major mistake that I think was made, and that's why, if you're asking me if they waited too long, first of all, on that level they waited too long, and then second of all, even under the strategy they picked, which is to go from north to south, I think that in war you go all the way, or you once you stop, you lose all momentum. It's really a big problem. They should have gone all the way. I understand the 10-day pause for the hostages. I understand the pause if there was another hostage deal, but they should not have negotiated under a pause. They should have had the pause as part of the deal. And let's be real, there was essentially a pause.
Let's say that Israel kills Sinwar, there's a hostage deal, the war ends, okay? Israel leaves Gaza, and they give back control of the Rafah crossing to whoever is running Gaza. We're just going to be fighting this war again in 5 years, right? I mean, if you do not close those tunnels, this is just going to continue, right?
Yeah, I don't see a situation in which Israel can give up security control of the Philadelphia corridor. That's again the border salient between Egypt and Gaza. Israel has to maintain control of what goes in and out for two reasons. One is obviously the weaponry and dual use stuff that could go in, but the second thing is the illegal corruption that is the Hamas governance. They made a lot of money and they funded this military war machine through that corruption. So you choke off both ends of it. But I think more than that, I think what we're seeing is overall the relationship with the Palestinians that Israel has tried to establish over the last 30 years, ever since Oslo, has collapsed and something different has to now obtain. The relationship with the Palestinian communities has to change. So I don't think you can go back to Israel keeps the border area, the Philadelphia corridor, but gives up the rest to the Palestinian Authority. I think Israel will have to maintain a presence, both security wise as well as in a more intrusive way. They have to, for lack of a better word, they have to denazify the population, and the population is generations of indoctrination. So the educational structure, for example, it can be under the control of some third party, but it has to be carefully monitored that it's actually an education structure rather than an indoctrination structure for the next round. On so many different levels, I think the Israelis simply have to maintain a very intrusive presence in Gaza after this, and then they can find local authorities or forces that can run the day-to-day lives. But I don't see Israel safely withdrawing from Gaza the way they did before in any shape or form.
Uh, does anybody at the top of Israel's government really believe this fantasy that an Arab country or army is going to come in and Saudi Arabia is going to be like, oh, we'll handle Gaza. we want that nightmare task. Does anybody really believe that?
No, I don't. I don't believe anybody in Israel in the position of authority really believes that first of all, whether it's the Palestinian army, say the PA, the Palestinian Authority, they don't trust it. They see it as just a more a refined face of the same thing they faced with Hamas. And more than that, they did turn it over to the Palestinian Authority in 2005. They didn't turn it over to Hamas, but Hamas has the political currency, and they're pretty sure that if the PA takes over again, they're going to lose immediately to Hamas again. So that's off the table. So you think, well, maybe a more friendly country like the UAE, the Saudis, and so forth. I don't believe there's a single Arab country that wants this headache. This is a no win. They don't like the Palestinians. They want this problem to go away. They know it's a hornet's nest. They know it's no win for them. So they're not going to save the Israelis from the Palestinians. So my sense is they may come in an assistance role. They would give money. They could send teachers to teach in schools. They could provide textbooks. They could build ports. They could build airports. They could do all sorts of supportive stuff. But day-to-day governance, they're going to stay away from like the plague. So I don't think that's realistic at all, and I don't think any Israeli government does. I think that the Israelis are split between those who believe that the PA is bad, but maybe it's still something salvageable, especially since that's what the Americans and the Europeans seem to think. And there are those who think that some other form of local governance is necessary.
Um, let's talk about the current strategy. Israel, the IDF is now retaking neighborhoods again and again. They've taken Shifa Hospital twice. It's happening in other neighborhoods. I wonder if you fear that this somewhat vague goal of destroying Hamas, outside of killing Sinmar, is going to lead Israel to just be playing whack-a-mole for years and at a high cost, rather than, say, scaling back the goal of let's disarm Hamas. Let's cut off those Rafah tunnels. Let's make make it clear to Hamas, we're not leaving the Rafah corner. So every bullet, every rocket you have, those are your last rockets. What do you think?
Well, I think the idea of destroying Hamas is that they no longer really govern. And if you cut off access to the outside world other than what is controlled by Israel, and you begin to maintain a pretty strong security presence, it's only a matter of time before the natural politics of the Palestinians will kick in, which is very much based on clans, tribes, families, etc. And there will be those who see gain in siding with the Israelis. And that Israel will slowly over time begin to develop a structure through the clans, through the families, where they can govern. It will, not Israel, but will have a governing body that they will be overseeing, so to speak. I think that's possible. I think that if you look at the time period, this requires patience. In 1967, when Israel took the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, they had full control of all the borders except for the Jordanian border. But the Jordanian government was on the same side as Israel. They saw Israel as an ally managing the Palestinian problem. And you saw it even with actual interactions, like for example, Black September, when the Israelis essentially helped the Jordanians crush the Palestinian revolt inside Jordan. So you had a contained entity that did not have any border to any hostile country or corrupt country that would use the corruption, where the corruption could be used by any coherent entity in the West Bank to form a real challenge to Israel. And still, it took 3 years for Israel to fully pacify the West Bank. It was a period called the Mirdaf, or the chase. And it took the IDF 3 years, and there were no tunnels back then, and it was far less populated, and a much more, and the traditional structures that were aligned still with Jordan were still fairly strong. So all the things that were going in Israel's way, it still took them 3 years. So this is not a short-term project Israel has. It will require for Israel years of hands-on activity with, yes, some whack-a-mole characteristics to it for quite some time, but it will over time degrade.
Here's a provocative question. If I was Israeli prime minister, Israel just celebrated Independence Day. I would give a speech. I would say, we're not celebrating Independence Day next year or the year after. We're only going to celebrate it once we make most of our munitions for our weapons in Israel, because we are currently not truly an independent state. Because I really believe and I've been saying for a while that you know who has a more pro-Israel stance on aid to Israel? Ilhan Omar. She has a more pro-Israel stance than Ted Cruz, ironically, because it's like heroin, and it's and especially with the rules where it has to be made in America. What do you think?
I actually think you're right. And I think that, and it's something you've been saying for a while, it's something I've been saying for a while, long before this war began, that I'm an intensely patriotic American. I served in the US military, but it's not healthy. It's not healthy what Israel's doing. First of all, it's not independent. And to me, it defeats the purpose of Zionism. Two, I think it compromises American support for Israel, because I think one of the things that really attracts Americans to Israel is that it is a little image of who we believe we ourselves are, which is, we've never asked anybody to fight our fights or do anything like that for us, or even to save us. We're not a save us culture. We respect people who stand on their own two legs and fight for what they believe in and don't compromise on their fundamental convictions, even if it's against all odds. And that's what we really like about Israel. And the more Israel has to compromise to maintain this security relationship with the United States, the more it erodes culturally American support and respect for Israel. So in the long run, I actually think the compromise to the United States undermines the relationship with the United States. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at the origins of the dependence, it shows exactly the problem, which is it was after 67. Israel felt extremely strong, and there was the war of attrition. The Arab side decided that they were going to continue the war at a lower level, fairly intense, but lower level, a war of attrition. The Israelis basically thought, okay, if they want to fight this war of attrition, we'll use it. We'll use it to keep the army of Egypt and the army of Syria pushed back about 40 kilometers, using artillery, commando raids, all sorts of violent activity in response to Egyptian violent activity. So Israel created a buffer zone on the Egyptian side of the border that allowed it to basically maintain a very thin line, which Israel needed. It was only 3.5 million, 4 million people after two and a half million after 73. After 1967. And Egypt was already 40, 50 million at that point, and Egypt was only one of many fronts. So Israel needed a structure which could rely on reserves, which meant most of the time their army is not very mobilized. It's a very thin line. So the buffer zone was on the Egyptian side using the violence. At the end of the war, the Egyptians were administered such a heavy blow that they asked for a ceasefire. The Israelis agreed under the condition that the Egyptians would remain deployed 40 kilometers back from the Suez Canal. And almost immediately, Egypt, of course, violated the ceasefire and started deploying forward. And the Israelis said, we got to restart the war. The United States came in and said, Israel, you really can't do that. We have a peace process. Sound familiar? We have a diplomatic process. Give the diplomatic process a chance. Back then, it was called the Rogers Plan. Israel said, we can't. This is too dangerous. Our defense doctrine is not viable under such circumstances. So the United States said, how about if we give you weapons? This is where really the qualitative military edge was born. We'll give you weapons that make you so superior to your enemy that you can absorb the first strike. You don't need to preempt, and you don't need a buffer zone. You can literally let them deploy and have such power for a second strike. Israel said, yeah, but we don't have money to pay for these wonderful weapons. And that's when you started seeing the sharp ramp up of U.S. aid. And with that, Israel then looked at the global conflict with the Soviet Union, where Israel was playing a significant role in facing the Soviet Union and the UN. And Israel made a choice that it would give up strategic autonomy and strategic maneuver in exchange for super advanced weapon systems and the diplomatic support internationally. I would argue that the 73 war's surprise was a strategic failure, not an intelligence failure. Yes, there was an intelligence failure, but the real failure was strategic, and it was anchored to that choice that Israel made. And instead of re-examining that choice, the Israeli military establishment has descended deeper and deeper and deeper into that paradigm of dependence ever since. So you're talking now a 50-year paradigm that has so thoroughly penetrated the culture of the IDF that they don't think anymore independently the way the IDF did in the 50s. And frankly, the odds against Israel in the 50s were infinitely greater than they are now. There's no reason for the Israelis to feel such weakness. But the mentality is deep in the military establishment.
I just want to take a quick detour on directed energy. The cost of Iron Dome, for instance, the Iran attack, it cost over $1 billion just to defend. Do you believe, but people say, well, we're going to get these directed energy air defense things soon, and it's much cheaper. Is that true?
I think it's probably true that the laser structures will be a lot cheaper, but I think the problem I have with that is the concept. It goes back to this defensive strategy. That Israel has not won a war since it's embraced this defensive concept. when it had preemption. And the whole story of Gaza that led up to October 7th was that Israel thought through successive measures of defensive means they could ultimately contain this problem and not really have to deal with it. They don't have to preempt, they don't have to go in, they don't have to go on the offensive, they can just build a better wall.
I get what you're saying. Where I was going is it's sort of a out there question, but I was thinking to myself, if let's say they came up with a directed energy or whatever, a new Iron Dome that's not 100 times, 30 times better and 100 times cheaper. I mean, like amazing.
Mhm.
Would that change your position on the riskiness of a two-state solution?
No, because what we saw on October 7th had nothing to do with missiles, basically. It's the inability, if you have a defensive strategy, first of all, it's going to be more expensive. Okay, so they have a much cheaper way of stopping the missiles. But the amount of forces Israel is going to have to deploy going forward on the Gaza border and on the northern border, and God forbid on the Egyptian or Jordanian border, because they have a defensive policy, is infinitely larger and more expensive than if you have an offensive policy. Whereas if there's a threat that emerges in Gaza, you act to neutralize it rather than just build a bigger wall. That's number one. Number two, eventually, the Palestinians, let's be real, Sinwar is not a dumb person. He's a very smart person. All these Palestinian leaders are very clever and very smart. The Arabs as a whole are not dumb people. And they will find a way around whatever wall you build. So there will be another October 7th. If you adopt a defensive strategy, there will be another October 7th, as there was on October 6th, 1973. There will be another October 7th, 2024, and there will be another one sometime in the future because it's inherent to having a defensive policy. When you look at the United States traditionally, you look at Israel, you look at Switzerland, these were democracies that had small armies or inability to really defend their realm on a daily basis because that was not their national character. They weren't mobilized societies. They went for reserve structures. The United States had the militias. The Swiss have their mobilization structure. Israel has a mobilization structure anchored or modeled after the Swiss structure. You use geography to create buffers. The Swiss used the mountains, the Americans used the oceans. That's why our Constitution says to maintain a navy and raise an army. The idea is that the buffer zone absorbs the first blow, and then we mobilize to respond. But you need to have a buffer zone to have a defensive strategy like that. Israel, if you give up, if Israel, its geographic buffer zone must include the West Bank and Gaza, and to some extent the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Without that buffer zone, Israel does not have the absorption geography to mobilize. And as a result, it's one or the other. Either they maintain control over those areas and they can maintain a second strike capability, or they lose control of those areas, in which case they have to go back to preemption and aggressive first strike to deal with problems proactively. So I don't see any way that Israel can give up either the West Bank or Gaza from a security point of view safely, because it simply is still a free country where people would rather mind their own business and live their lives rather than have an army that is half the size of the country all the time.
I see your point, but and so it sort of answers my next question, but I'm going to ask
Yeah.
it anyways because it's sort of interesting. I grew up with a family friend, one of the young people who's now one of the heads of Jewish Voices for Peace. So I know sort of what she grew up with, and when we were children, there was this discussion of the peace process, two-state solution. Okay. When Netanyahu came back in 2008, 2009, that idea has sort of died. There's not a lot of talk about peace process, two-state solution. And in 2008, that anti-Zionist, that BDS movement was pretty small, and now it's quite a bit larger. And part of the reason why, there are many reasons, but part of the reason why is I suspect if you're a Jewish or non-Jewish person and you have a natural empathy for, let's just say, Palestinians in suffering, they don't have a peace process to support. They feel like this is all they have because they believe Netanyahu's totally given up on it. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think there's actually two angles to this. First of all, is there's a certain image that we Jews have of ourselves. We don't think of ourselves as occupiers or as imperial. We don't even value power for power's sake. So we're uncomfortable. We believe it's our land, but we also understand there's a very real demographic problem. We're not so cruel that we're just going to throw everybody out. And at the same time, we do believe we're liberal. We're deeply liberal in our soul. I don't mean by that little L, American liberal versus conservative. I mean classic liberal. We believe in universal aspiration for freedom of mankind. So we have a very difficult time reconciling the demographic and democratic conundrum that is created by the West Bank and Gaza. And that's why we thought we found something with Oslo. If the PLO represented realization the conflict was over, and it was simply a mechanism to come up with a practical solution for Israel to disengage from Gaza and from the West Bank and turn it over to a self-governing entity, if even something that is a proto-state that eventually would evolve into a state, then great, we solve our problem. Because it's a question of borders, and it's a question of safety, and it's a question of simply allowing them to come to terms. And we really, really wanted to believe that. What we didn't understand on that level was that the Palestinian side still saw its nationalism as the negation of Jewish nationalism. That's why you couldn't see Mohammed Abbas ever admit that there was a temple. Not saying you guys had a temple, but for God's sake, guys, it's 2,000 years, get over it, or anything like that. No, he had to deny the very indigenousness of Jews to the territory, because Palestinian nationalism was a negation. Also, moreover, bringing in the PLO, there were negotiations over what to do about the Palestinians that lived under Israeli control with local leaderships. There are practical solutions to that. The problem is the moment you bring in the PLO represented the questions of 1948. Does Israel have a right to exist? Do all those millions of refugees that are outside of Israel have the right of return, which would imply the destruction of Israel? The moment you brought in the PLO, you brought in an organization committed to the negation of Israel, and you negated yourself. So it was baked into the very heart of Oslo. And many of us, liberals, not only those who sought aspirations for freedom, but young Israelis who had fought in the 73 war, saw horror in front of their eyes, shaken to the bone, sat there with their 1 or 2 or 3-year-old daughters or sons, and they said, "You will not go through what I went through. I promise you, you will not go through what I went through." So when there was any Arab leader that came forward and said, "Listen, we're willing to talk to you," it was a promise they made to their own kids after 73 that they will never turn that down. So I fully understand what happened with Oslo, but failure was baked in. Now, why was it growing over time? I think because essentially the negation part of it took time for people to begin to realize. I think it was inherent from the beginning. But the grounding on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza took time to establish. I believe what we're seeing now is the inevitable result of Oslo, but it didn't happen overnight. So over time, I think it eroded that way. The second thing I think that is difficult. Well, there was something else I wanted to say about that, but being already too old, I forget.
It was a good answer. But this is a difficult. I want to sort of stay on this because it is a very difficult question, and I try to listen. Unfortunately, I went to Hebrew school, but it didn't really take, so I can't read it, I can't speak it, sadly. But I consume as much English language Israeli media as I can get. Um, and when I listen to some figures of the far right in Israel, say like Moshe Feiglin, okay,
Yeah.
and they talk about, treat Gaza like Dresden, just there shouldn't be one structure standing. I know that people on the Israeli right will say, oh, the Israeli leftists, they're totally delusional. They would be setting us up for destruction. But in a way, there are, to me, it seems like there also is delusions on the Israeli far right. That, for instance, they could just do that and the world will just accept. I mean, what do you make of that?
No, I agree with you. I think that, there's, first of all, there's international realities. There's also the realities of who we are. We're not that. We're not going to Dresden, all of Gaza. It's just not who we are. And you have to, in war, go forward. It doesn't have to be a full consensus, but there has to be a large sense of morality and justice in what you're doing. And you don't, as a strategic matter, want to refocus this on your evil as opposed to their evil. So I would prefer that they don't do that. I do see some areas in which I agree with them. I think, unfortunately, what we see with Arab leaderships, and that's not only Hamas, but more broadly, is a complete disregard for the welfare of their people. Not all. I think, for example, King Abdullah of Jordan does care about his people. I have my critiques of him, but I don't think he hates his people. And same in the UAE and some of the Gulf countries and so forth. But when you get to Hamas, even the Egyptian government, and the PA, I don't think they really care that much about their people, but they do care, and the Iranians certainly don't care about the Palestinian people. What they do care about is, from a much more religious point of view, are they on the side of right? And right doesn't mean we preserve our people. What it means is that this territory is ours, and it's a verdict on whether we're good Muslims. And Allah favors us because we're good Muslims if we retain that territory or retake that territory. So I believe there is an element where defeat that defeats the political idea of Hamas to some extent has to be done with some territorial issue. I'm not saying Israel should annex Gaza or settle it or expel any population, but even if it's a centimeter, the border should be adjusted just to show that there is a territorial loss and you have brought a tragedy on your people and Allah does not favor you.
Do you know Eric Weinstein? The
No.
mathematician, hedge fund guy, works for Peter Thiel. He had an
I know
interesting.
Peter, actually. I know Peter, but I don't know Eric Weinstein.
He runs Thiel Capital, so basically he runs Peter Thiel's hedge fund, I think. He had an interesting idea.
That's Clarion, right? Clarion, something.
Yeah, he has all sorts of organizations.
Yeah. I know. He has Palantir. He has all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
And one of the ideas Eric Weinstein suggested was that, and he's a mathematician, but it was sort of interesting outside the box. He said Israel should just announce, if every rocket we're going to take 10 yards or whatever.
Right.
Quantify.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
It's land for peace, but the inverse. And that for every piece you violate, you lose a bit of land.
And have ceremonies and name each piece of land after the victim that was killed or something. That's one thing. But let me challenge you a little bit on the Palestinian thing. I hear the argument all the time from Israelis. We can't give the Palestinians a state because I mean, look at the poll numbers in the West Bank, or as you would say, Judea and Samaria. I'll go with the West Bank for that personally, but they'll say, look how much support Hamas has in the West Bank, and the way I would respond is that's true. And there's a lot of problems in Palestinian society. But put yourself in the shoes of a 19-year-old Palestinian young guy. They look at Hamas, they carry guns, they take action, they're doing something. They look at Abbas, and they view him as an old clown collaborator who lets the Israeli Jews go deeper and deeper into the West Bank with settlements, eating up what was supposed to be our future state. And they're like, well, I have self-respect. How can I support Abbas? Well, what do you think of that?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the power. Again, going back to the religious question, what we don't get is the way it looks to Iran, to Hezbollah, to the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, is Arab nationalist army after Arab nationalist army attacked Israel, and Israel got bigger. They got smaller. They lost territory. And eventually, because of that, it was clear Arab nationalism failed in their mind, and it was obviously not graced by the will of Allah, because why would they be losing all that consistently? Then came Hezbollah and started hitting Israel hard in Lebanon over and over again. Came Hamas and started hitting Israel from Gaza and from the West Bank in terrorism. To the point where by 92, 93, etc., the Israelis began to wear down, and they wanted to unilaterally leave the areas of Lebanon they had as a buffer zone. You had a lot of movement in Israel about leaving Gaza. You had Yitzhak Rabin basically say we need peace more than we need peace more than they do, etc. You started seeing the will of Israel break because of this violence. This is the viewpoint of Iran, the viewpoint of these Islamist forces, which then led not Arafat's coming to terms with Israel, but their violence is what gave Arafat the ability to get back territory. It was Hezbollah's violence that gave them the ability to get Israel to leave. So for them, consistently, there was a territorial retreat when the Islamists went forward. And that's an element of not only pride, but it's also an element of religious validation. Or not religious validation of this religious extremist Islamist view of the world. That if you return to purity and you return to the expansion of Islam as your single goal, your jihad and so forth, then you are returning to the Salaf, to the original forefathers' spirit, and then Allah will reward you with success. So, and by the way, you saw it more regionally with the expulsion of Americans from here and expulsion of Americans from there and so forth at the hands of Islamists. So that's one of the reasons why, if you're young and you're the West Bank and obviously been exposed to this incitement as well as raised as a good religious kid, it seems that indeed the Arab nationalist forces like the PLO are dead. And for good reason, because they forgot who they were. But Hamas does not. Palestinian Islamic Jihad does not. So we will ride them to victory. We want to be part of the victorious rising concern. That's the way it looks.
But if you wanted to reduce West Bank Palestinian support of Hamas, wouldn't you sort of stop making Abbas look bad with, allowing deeper settlement expansion? No?
No, I actually think the opposite. I think a Jewish confidence that says we're willing to give up a good bit of the territory. However, there are certain areas you've lost. You've waited too long. You've lost. And this rejectionist policy toward peace that first Arafat had, that Abu Mazen had, and certainly that Hamas had, the consequence of what they did is we've lost more territory. In other words, prove them to be failures and a permanent failure. And the currency for that is land, not people. So another settlement, a piece of land in Gaza, this drives home the point that they have failed theologically, ideologically, and politically, that they've brought a disaster, another Nakba. And that indicts their idea, the idea behind Hamas. That's how you defeat. Remember, war and strategy is not a military question. Ultimately, it's a political act. And the purpose of victory in war is to break the political will of your opponent. And in this case, the opponent is Hamas, not the Palestinians, Hamas. And their political will is anchored to the conviction they have of being the agent of Allah, executing what it is that Allah wishes, and achieving great success from that. And the validation comes from the success. Failure indicts the idea and ultimately defeats the movement that is waging war. It defeats the political idea.
But
that's where the victory comes from.
But don't you have to provide these people with a more moderate path than, I mean, what or let me put it this way. People often say there is a Palestinian state. It's Jordan, and it's true. It's actually very interesting that the mandate was supposed to include Transjordan, and then it was changed. And so you can actually, it's not actually as absurd an argument as many people will believe. But can you really sell that to America? I mean, are people really going to accept that idea?
I don't know, to America. Because I don't think we properly appreciate the Middle East and its politics. And in some ways, we need to take a lesson from medicine. First, do no harm. Then try to do good. At this point, our lack of understanding is doing harm. And you know, again, as a great patriot, I think we should back off. As far as the hope from an Israeli and an Arab point of view, the real issue is to return Palestinian society to a degree of normalcy. And I believe, I mean, this is a very deep conversation, but the PLO, Hamas, all these Palestinian organizations are revolutionary organizations to transform what were localized identities, Hebronite, Ramallahite, Nablusite, Jeninite, Gazaite identities, which really had no commonality to them, but were strong identities, to try to transform these. And that goes, it's a 150-year thing. It started with the Turks, the Ottomans, and the Tanzimat, where they tried to revolutionize centralized control by breaking down these localized structures and imposing Circassians and people from the outside as the revolutionary elite to centralize control, because these tribes, these clans, they were ungovernable. There was a sort of a status quo. You know, you have your autonomy, you have your semi-independence. We don't bother you, you don't bother us, but you're part of the Ottoman Empire. But we don't really have the authority over you. That worked. The moment the Ottoman Empire said, no, we have to be like a European empire, we have to control everything in our borders. That's where the problem started. It was a centralized attempt to control. And they had to create a new elite imposed on these tribes and clans and families. And that started breaking down the traditional structure and creating a revolutionary elite that couldn't put the pieces together, so always sought an external enemy for unity to justify their crushing internally. And that then transformed into the Nazi efforts to have a new elite, the British efforts, then the Soviet efforts, and now the PLO, Hamas, and so forth. So to me, the very idea of a state is going to create the next round of problems. What you need to focus on is resurrection of these local forms of autonomy and independence and rebuild traditional Palestinian society. And where local Qadis and local leaderships, etc., really govern their lives, but really govern their lives, and slowly come to an understanding with the Israelis who are above it all, but essentially allow them full autonomy internally.
But how long is the? I mean, do you support Israel formally annexing parts of? I'll use it. No offense. What, the West Bank?
Yeah, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, no, I do. I do believe Israel should formally annex because I think there's no territorial, there's really no territorial definition of these local identities. They are local. So I think the moment that you start thinking of it as a national territory, you're back into the national revolutionary elites and all the upheaval. You can't have a national structure because that will then impose on all these natural localized forms of identity. And that's why that. But the second thing is, I really do think it's very important to defeat the idea of Hamas, defeat the idea of Arab nationalism. That can only be done by the symbolic loss of territory.
Now,
So I
if
think annexing the territory is actually a very important strategic move.
but I assume in the territory you would like to annex, the Arabs, the Palestinians there would be able to vote.
Yeah, I believe that wherever Israel extends its border, those people become citizens,
Okay.
full citizens. So what it means is that the annexation would have to take into account
Okay.
strongly demographic issues.
Okay. When I imagine if Israel was destroyed, let's say in 40 years, I can imagine a right wing scenario of how that happens and a left wing way.
Uh-huh.
There's a version where Israel, let's say they just elect these hippie communist guys and they're like, peace and love, dude, and they get invaded and it's over. That's the
Yeah.
right wing.
Well, if
version.
there really was a Palestinian state on
Yeah.
October 7th,
Yeah.
In the full
Yeah.
amount of the West Bank, Jerusalem would have fallen. The corridor to Jerusalem would have fallen. Israel would have been cut in two. Netanya would have fallen. North of Tel Aviv would have been fallen. Basically, I don't think the country would have survived,
Yeah.
and that's assuming that Hezbollah did not attack.
You make a good point because people always got to remember how small Israel is. It's such an important. Okay, but that's a right wing version of how I could see Israel being destroyed. But I do also see a left wing vision of how it could be destroyed. Let's say next year Israel elects Ben Gvir. Okay. Let's say the support in Israel for Israel in America declines precipitously in West Europe, in America, and then it is isolated and no longer has the U.S.'s diplomatic protection at the UN. Can you imagine that scenario as well?
Well, I do believe, Israel, I'm one for Israel acting as independently as possible. I think it's the whole essence of Zionism is that we Jews have mastery over our own fate. But that said, you have to be strategically wise. I mean, you can't pick a fight with the entire world and go to war with Russia, America, China, et cetera, et cetera. There's realities you have to deal with. So that's, of course, one area where I believe there might be some on the right who don't get that. The second thing is the moral fiber of the country is its greatest strength. And you can maybe, if you're Ben Gvir, you can stomach these questions. But 60 to 70% of Israelis cannot. And you can't have 60, 70% of Israelis going to war thinking that they're the evil side. So you really need to operate on some degree of national consensus morally, your image of what is a Jew and what it means to be Jewish. That doesn't mean you give in to the 20, 30% on the far left either. Precisely the opposite. I think they do the same problem. But I think there's a real problem there. The last thing, too, is that Israel does have. I think it doesn't fully appreciate sometimes how much it's part of the overall Western question. The West begins with Mount Sinai. Well, it might have began with Mount Moriah, but it certainly passed through Mount Sinai. There is no fundamental contradiction between the way the West is defined by the United States and Judaism. The opposite is a very Judeo-Christian concept of individual rights. And I think sometimes the far right in Israel removes itself from that debate, not fully understanding some of these larger philosophical issues that really govern the foundations of the state. So I think that there's a great deal of problem there. And then finally, you do have an issue of it is difficult to manage a population that is so hostile. You really, maybe you can manage it in terms of being above it all, over the horizon present, but it's under your overall security structure. But ultimately, people have, you have to let these people govern themselves. At the end, where a traffic light goes in Nablus should be something the neighborhoods in Nablus decide. Where a sewer goes, and also that's how you develop a responsible political leadership. The Israelis keep thinking that these leaderships revert back to Hamas. Well, yeah, of course, because UNRWA, the United Nations, UNICEF, all did everything for them. They didn't have to do any governance. You had the international structures providing them the schools, the food, the everything. So they could be busy just doing their wars. And if they fight their wars and schools are destroyed and money is spent, they don't care because they're still the government. But when you're the guy who's responsible for setting up the traffic lights and running the schools, then all of a sudden you're going to think twice. Gee, do I really want to anger the Israelis? And they blow up the school. All of a sudden, a different calculation begins to set in. So you create over a generation or two a new leadership. Any parent knows this about kids. At a certain point, you got to give them some autonomy so they learn their mistakes and learn how to be an adult. That's essentially it's the low expectation that is really preventing and retarding the political evolution of Palestinian society. They should be held to high expectations.
I tend to disagree. I think Israel, for its survival, should not abandon the two-state paradigm. We disagree. You make great arguments on that, and I totally get it, especially because of how small and vulnerable Israel is territorially. But I wonder if you would agree with this. I'll tell people that if the Israeli Knesset, for whatever reason, said, hey, Daniel, you got 10 minutes. We're listening. Give us your advice. I would say, whether you're Ben Gvir or you're Labor, that Israel probably has a 15 to 20-year window. Just because of demographic changes, there's a much larger Muslim Arab population in America and Europe.
Yeah.
This window, and it's, you could use it to do the right-wing plans or the left-wing plans, but this is sort of the window. So if you're going to do the two-state solution and you want to get the best terms on a demilitarized whatever thing, this is your window. And if you want to do the other stuff, this is also your window. Do you agree with that?
Not fully. I'll tell you. There was a debate in the United States. Richard Haas, who was very close to Condoleezza Rice, wrote an article on foreign affairs. This was in 2001, basically saying, yeah, it's a unipolar, not related to the Middle East. It's a unipolar moment. The United States is immensely powerful, and the rest of the world is not. So this is the moment where we have to write the international rules so that when we become weaker in the future, which we inevitably will, the rules are written in our favor to preserve our hegemony. And my big problem with that was China's not stupid. When they have the power, they'll rewrite the rewritten rules. So I don't think, if you're talking about the demographic or political progressive or whatever time bomb in the West, I don't think anything Israel does in terms of acceding to Palestinian statehood will stop what we're seeing on the campuses. The opposite, I think it might actually incite it further because it gives them hope that Israel's on the run, that it's weaker, that it had to give in, that the pressure worked. And moreover, I think it validates the idea that the Israelis are illegally occupying land, and half a crime is still a crime. So it validates the legitimacy of the Palestinian claim, which in these diaspora communities, whether it's Palestinian diaspora communities or these Muslim or Arab or Pakistani communities in the West, they do not accept the legitimacy of Zionism. They don't see it as two nations legitimately with legitimate rights for the territory who need to split the difference. And if they manage to split the difference, we'll accept it. They do not see the legitimacy of the Jewish nationhood. And therefore, whatever happens, I think they will. The internal demographic time bomb, I think, it's real because I think it's capped. I don't think it's getting worse. The actual numbers are that Israel's birth rate is higher now than the Arab. The Jewish birth rate is higher than the Arab birth rate. And there is a net emigration now in the territories. But you're still talking about a population that is 40% of the people that live between the river and the sea. So,
Yeah.
I mean, even if that stays that way, this is still one hell of a demographic problem that you can't just brush away, and you can't expel them either. So, at the end, yeah, you could talk about voluntary transfer incentives, whatever. Yeah, we'll see if that's ever anything real. Right now, you got to deal with the reality. You've got 40% of everybody who lives between the river and the sea is not Jewish. And you've got to cope with that. And maybe it'll be 35% in 10 years or even 30%, but that's still an extremely large amount of people. So to not have distortion of Israeli politics, to have a genuinely Jewish state where you don't have this problem of basically 30% of the country does not want to be part of it. I think there is a demographic issue, and that is something the right has to deal with. Now, I don't believe in the two-state solution because, as you said, the whole Jordan-Palestine thing, this is really a three-state solution. I think we have to go back to what was the Jordanian solution. I think once the Israel wins and there's power, various solutions will come up, possibly even an independent state that's viable and stable. But for the moment, my imagination takes me only to what I call the Jordanian option. Not that Jordan becomes Palestine, but that Jordan becomes sort of co-ruler of that territory, of the Arab areas of that territory. There may be a local governance and local parliament that is loosely connected with a Hashemite confederacy. Maybe in the end, you can redraw something in Jordan where the Hashemites, the tribe of the south, is separated from the north, which is more Palestinian urban. And so I don't know what works out, but you can have some working solution, practical solution that is a temporary being maybe 50 years or 100 years with Jordan to work out the dispensation so that there's no question and where the borderline between that is in Israel, rather than trying to implant the third party, a wildcat third party that Jordan and Israel both are potentially threatened by.
Yeah, I mean, me and you, we disagree on a lot of this stuff, but one thing I think we agree on is you cut those Rafah tunnels. It's only 7 miles, 7.5 miles. And if we can, the analogy I've been making is Hamas without rockets is like Megadeth without amplifiers. Okay.
Yeah.
And so once you cut off those weapons, then maybe more peaceful possibilities arise. I wanted to ask these Israeli academics, Ilan Pappé, Avi Shlaim, Raz Siegel, this professor who said
The
Israel was committing.
post-Zionists, yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
post
He said Israel was committing genocide on October 16th. Um, what are your thoughts on them? And do you have a message to young American Jews who are anti-Zionist about what would a world without Israel, what would that mean for Jews?
First of all, if you think Palestinians would fare better in any other system than Israel, I would remind them what Lebanon looked like when the PLO was strong and ran their own affairs, what Syria is like now, what Iraq was for a few years until we stabilized it. And unfortunately, now it's under Iranian control to some extent. But in terms of internally, that stabilizes it a bit. Or what Libya looks like. The bottom line is what I'm trying to say is what happened on October 6th and the violence that Israel had in 2002 with the second Intifada and the bus bombs and the terrible week where 300 were killed in Park Hotel. And what happened is really an extension of the internal violence of Palestinian society that I attribute in part to these efforts that started with the Ottoman Turks to try to revolutionize society. I think there was a far more stable structure 200 years ago than there was after these attempts. But whatever have you, you have a distortion now. The second thing is the Arab state as a whole is a problematic question, and it's failing in a lot of places where the state was sort of artificially created, was in Syria or so forth. So if there were no Israel, you would see violence on an unbelievable level. It would be a bloodbath. And Palestinians would remain what they are now, which is to some extent the football of Arab politics. It's really the language through which Arabs, larger forces in the Arab world, fight each other through the Palestinian issue. The PLO was created primarily as an instrument, a tentacle of Egypt into other Arab countries, not to really destroy Israel. I mean, it used the Israel question, but that is the bottom line. So to me, Israel actually prevents the Palestinian side from encountering a horrific bloodbath at the hands of other Arabs.
What do you think of this? The Elon Papes and the Raz Siegels and these guys.
I think some are more honest, like Benny Morris, who when
Benny
he sees
Morris
something
is different though. Benny Morris is
exactly.
Yeah.
When he sees something, ultimately he's a slave to facts. And when he sees facts that didn't accord with what he thought he saw, he changed what he saw. Elon Pape and the rest bend what they see to what they want to see. It is an inverted structure, and moreover, it's now part of the larger question that you see rising on the progressive far radical, not all progressives, but some of the radical progressives, which is narrative trumps facts. Namely, even if something is proven to be a lie, like the Tantura massacre, the great Tantura massacre of 1948, it's definitively been proven a lie because the guy who created the story has admitted that he made it up. That's Teddy Katz. He was a PhD student under Ilan Pape at Haifa University. He's the one who created this whole Tantura massacre. And he admitted that he made it up. There was no massacre. Then he recanted on that, but whatever. He admitted it. And also, village elders from that area said so too. And there's no gray. Just over and over, it's clear. The problem that we have is that there is this view that the narrative approximates a reality. So even if it's not true, not factually true, it approximates the greater truth. Well, this is the blurring between fiction and documentary, fiction and nonfiction, reality and not reality. There is objective truth. There are real facts, not just what you perceive. There are real facts. There were 200 Palestinians killed in 1948 in Tantura, or there were not. That's not a matter of interpretation. So So unfortunately, when you get to the world of the Ilan Papes and so forth and Avi Schleins, you've gotten into the world where the narrative trumps the facts, and that becomes ideological.
Let me
So I
just play
believe that
devil's
they're operating from an ideological point of view, not a scholarly point of
so,
view.
let me just play devil's advocate for them. They would say, David, all I want is one state of equal rights where Israeli is treated like Palestinian. What? Why can't we have that? What would you say?
Well, you do. That's Israel within its borders. Arabs serve in parliament, they have rights. Do they are they going to be prime minister? No, because Arabs are only 18% of the population. Now, are there Arabs that were in ruling coalition? Absolutely. Are there Arabs that are even in the Likud party? Yes. So Israel basically is a modern Western society that is no apartheid. Uh, the Supreme Court is very strong. The court systems are very strong, and they really do emphasize equal rights. Now, there are some structural issues. For example, if you don't serve in the Israeli military, you have less benefits than if you did. The United States is that way too. Veterans' benefits are quite nice. And obviously, many Arabs don't serve. They're not required to serve in the Israeli military. So many don't. They don't have those benefits. And I understand that's a structural issue. I believe the Israelis should actually create some form of national service for them where they can maybe do something else, reclaim land, something that's not military. But also, there's a lot of Arabs that are beginning to serve in the military. Uh, Bedouin, if you look at the numbers of Bedouin who were killed on October 7th that were in the military, there were also Bedouin who were not. There are Bedouin who were in the military, Druze, others. You're beginning to see these minorities, Druze, absolutely, and Assyrians, absolute Assyrians, Arameans, not Armenians, Arameans. These communities are already serving heavily in the Israeli military, heavily. And Bedouin in the south, many do as well. So you do see this breaking down. Christian Arabs are now beginning to enter the Israeli military in significant numbers. Yosef Haddad, who's on internet all the time, is one of them. Things are changing. So Israel is a model of where it should go. The problem we have is we have a very practical problem, which is Israel can't absorb all those Arabs and still remain demographically Jewish and democratic. So it's in limbo. So it tried to give it up. It tried to give it up in 48. It tried to give it up after 67 and say, we'll give you back the territory, just make peace. They tried to give it up in Oslo. They tried to give it up with disengagement. The problem is every inch of territory they gave up became a launching pad to kill Jews from. So there's a very practical issue, and this is not prone, and this is not given to black and white ideological determination. One has to be very sober and acknowledge that there are legitimate reasons why Israel must maintain its presence in the West Bank and Gaza uh, to survive. And its survival is an act of democratic freedom because internally it is a free paradise for all the inhabitants that live in it: Arab, Jewish, Druze, Circassian, Assyrian, Arameans, Armenians, everybody.
What would you say to these young anti-Zionist Jews about? Because I think often they do not think about, okay, there is no more Israel. There's no more right of return. There's no more safe haven for the 10 Jews of Dagestan who were being chased around that airport. They have no safe haven. I don't think they think about what that would mean. I think they think, oh, things wouldn't.
Yeah.
In fact, some of them think it would be better. That it would be great for the Jewish.
You're not going to find a lot of Israelis like that. You're not going to find a lot of Jews from Arab countries. You're not going to find very many European Jews saying that right now. And the reason is European Jews faced this before American Jews. But our security, the golden age of American Judaism, which, by the way, goes back to before America was created. This has been a remarkable diaspora. And one, great credit to the Jews who made it up, and great credit to the non Jews who allowed it to be created. letters from George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. This has been a paradise for Jews. And in the framework of that, it seemed the Peter Beinart view, which is Jews can become a religion focused on ethics and values, etc., sort of the world conscience. And we can remain Jews because we're safe. It seemed to be something you could believe in. But now, when you look at the campuses, all of a sudden, an ugliness has reemerged that we didn't see in America. Really, we have never really seen in America. And it's creating a sense of insecurity that reminds Jews that is ingrained in our DNA that, wait a second, there is a danger to being a minority. We say on Passover, on the path, in every generation there will arise someone who will seek to eliminate us, to finish us off. Most Jews in the world inherently understand that. American Jews have forgotten that because it's so secure and it was so distant. I remember going to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and the question is, could it happen in America? And every American, myself included, said, oh, come on, look at America. I mean, there's no way it would happen in America. I know my friends, my non-Jewish friends, my neighbors, they wouldn't do such a thing. And maybe that's true, but that's not true of most of the world's Jews. And in the long run, I think it's also one of the reasons why the most golden part of the golden age of Judaism was since Israel's creation. The confidence and the safety of Jews globally contributed to our self-confidence that allowed us to wade in fully as full Americans, not as Jews living in America, but as full participant Americans, because we had the backstop of security and confidence that a nation like Israel gave us. So, on that note, what I'm trying to say is that we Jews have two Memorial Days. One was the one just 2 days ago where we honor the Israeli soldiers who died and all those people who died defending the state of Israel, creating the state of Israel, and defending the Jewish communities of the Yeshuv, of the pre-state Jewish community. And then we also, a week and a half ago, had the Remembrance Day for the Holocaust, what happened in Auschwitz. And the whole idea is we have two Remembrance Days because one, the more recent one, the one we just had a day and a half ago, reminds you of the cost of having your state and your independence and your freedom. The other one reminds you of the cost of not having your state and not having your freedom. And both of them are absolutely important to remember.
Some people on Twitter say, I saw people saying any Jew, American Jew who votes for Biden is a capo and or something, stuff like that. And I totally disagree. I know you probably disagree with me on this, but I want to just lay out this position. And these are just facts, okay? And Biden has all sorts of problems. We all know that. But Trump did dine with two Hitler lovers in the last 2 years, Nick Fuentes, Kanye West. And do you know Douglas McGregor?
I do know Douglas McGregor. I don't know him personally.
Yeah.
I know of him. Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. He's not a big fan of Israel.
And neither is Candace Owens, and neither is Tucker Carlson.
I'm saying, but do you remember Trump put McGregor near the top of, I believe, the Pentagon at the end of his first term?
Yeah.
Given those two facts, and also I've listened to a lot of the Trump interviews about Israel, and honestly, it seems like the first thing he wants to talk about when people bring up Israel and the war is, boy, Bibi screwed me by not pretending I was still the president. Are you sure he's going to be as reliably pro-Israel as some people think?
I think he'll be relatively pro-Israeli, but I would be careful. There's a lot of warning signs with him, like you note. First of all, I really wish it wasn't the case, but maybe there's a way that Bibi can repair his relationship with with Trump. But Trump, if you look, when you're mud with him, you're mud. I mean, I worked for John Bolton, and we all know what happened with John Bolton. Judge Sessions, Liz Cheney. One forgets Liz Cheney worked a lot at the beginning with Trump. Trump, when he turns on somebody, he turns on somebody, and he it overwhelms his judgment. Number one. Number two, President Trump turns the world, and in this he represents sort of an American spirit, but it's carried to an extreme that is a bit dangerous, which is divides the world up into winners and losers. Americans like winners. They like winners who have conviction. They believe that conviction is power, and that we're strong because we're America was great before it was strong. It was precisely the conviction of America from when we were a tiny independent nation struggling. We beat the greatest empire on the face of the earth in 1776, 7, 8, up until, and then again in 1812. So we believe in winners and losers, but the winning comes from the fidelity to your convictions. Trump believes in winners and losers. It has almost nothing to do with morality in his mind. And the problem he has with Israel is, you could see it in his reaction to October 7th. Gee, maybe they're not such a winner. And suddenly there was a distance. You could see it instantly. Now, Israel may, for the 4 years of a Trump presidency, have the ability to act like a winner. And he'll let them act like a winner. So in that sense, I think he'd be pro-Israeli. And you also can't get around the fact that his grandkids are Jewish and his kids are, he's not going to be anti-Jewish, but at the same time, he's a hardball politician who will traffic with those who may be anti-Semitic. And he doesn't, the same problem with the extreme of Ben Gvir. Or frankly, on the other side, trafficking with the extremes of Ilhan Omar for Biden. You may not agree with them, but you're indicted by them if you don't differentiate yourself from them. And let's be real, there is a growing anti-Semitic, isolationist, and even pro-Russian element growing on the far right. It is not, in my view, it's not quite as prevalent as the far left. The progressive, not as acute, but it can very rapidly become that. And it's equally concerning, not only as a Jew, but as an American, because I don't see American power and American greatness to be furthered by either view on either of those ends. So I'm really very concerned about the rise of the right, far right, the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, Candace Owen, right? And I'm very concerned about the radical progressive left. And I don't believe that Jews who support Biden are capos or whatever. I get it. The Democrats have been a very important structure. They've been better for the Jews for most of the last 50, 70 years. Hard to give up on that. And you don't want to fully give up on that. You want them to beat the hardcore progressive left. You want to help the liberals in the Democratic Party. You don't want to throw them out with the bathwater. Similarly, on the conservative side.
I'm glad you acknowledge that on the right, and
it gives me no end to indigestion and anger.
And perhaps you've noticed this yourself, but it's a very interesting thing. It hasn't been noted as much as I wish. What I fear is happening on the far right with the rise of anti-Semitism is we've seen, if you look at the far right, say in the last 10 years, there's been a de-emphasis on the sort of racism and a more of an emphasis on the anti-Semitism. And I think that's for a practical reason. The country is becoming more diverse. So, for instance, Nick Fuentes, these groypers, some of these people, these online Nazis, have been unmasked. And, some of them are Latino.
Yeah.
Some of them are from India. Some of them are half Asian. And so what I feel we're seeing is that there's a new diverse far right And so, to as a solidifying agent, anti-Semitism is acting as that force.
I
Like,
think that's a
okay,
very, very
yeah,
important
yeah.
observation.
You might be half Latino, or you might be Indian, but hey, look, we all hate the Jews, you know,
Mhm.
and that's what it's scary. But I think that's sort of what's
No,
happening.
I look, the radical left, the progressive, radical progressive left wraps itself in the flag of morality, which is misplaced and misinformed, if not outright dishonest. And the and the radicalism on the right, the radical isolationist crowd, is wrapping itself in the American flag and Americanism and the idea of American freedom. I can only say one thing to that. Our founding fathers were basically Judeo-philic. Benjamin Franklin wasn't the greatest friend of the Jews, but he also, at the same time, was deeply involved with the synagogues in Philadelphia. They helped him, he helped them. He had a good working relationship with them. But when you get beyond Ben Franklin, who never said anything truly anti-Semitic, but you get to George Washington, you get to some of the others, you get people who are downright Judeo-philic. They love Jews. They thought the Jews were truly the people of the Bible who need to be preserved, who are a great part, in addition to the American enterprise and American experiment. So I don't see how you can be genuinely pro-American, wrap yourself in the flag in 1776, and be anti-Semitic.
Well, they openly hate the founders, and they don't want a democracy. They want a Catholic dictatorship or whatever. I have
I
to,
don't know what they want. They want a European style right.
yeah,
They don't
yeah.
want an American right.
I want to close on this because I just want to, because your career, we could have done a whole show on your career, but I wanted to
It'd
just
be a tragedy, yeah,
yeah. No, but
or a comedy. Maybe a
you know,
tragic comedy.
I've always I thought if I ever got an opportunity to talk to someone like you, especially a Jewish neoconservative in the Bush administration, I wanted to ask about the way that people like you have been vilified. I mean, I remember I just when I was growing up, I just like the conspiracy genre. I don't believe maybe the JFK thing. I maybe believe something about that, but pretty much I am allergic to all the other ones. But I would just watch the 9/11 truth documentaries and stuff, and it'd just be like interesting stuff as a genre. But the most interesting thing to me was these documentaries always they're like, oh, Bush, Cheney, yeah, no. It's these Jews. It's Dov
Yeah,
Zakheim. It's Paul Wolfowitz. It's David Wurmser. It's Doug Feith. They were really, which is so telling
yeah.
that's how they would do it. I'm curious about have you been harassed by 9/11 truthers, and what does that feel like to be the target?
Well, back then I was. I mean, there were even points where the police had to do extra searches in my neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there was always some things like that. Now I'm frankly a bit more worried about the Iranians because they know who I am. They think things of me that I wish they didn't think, and maybe not always untrue, but the Iranians worry me a bit more than the truthers, and those do. But that said, uh, it's very easy because we, all of us, have never really spoken about what we did in that period. And part of it is because a lot of what we did was classified. And it's not ours to divulge that. Maybe after 25 years, we can begin to, and 25 years is about beginning next year. But there's processes for doing that. And it's very easy to imagine things about what our concerns were and what we were thinking and create ideas from that. And there's some coherence to those ideas, which make them even more pervasive and convincing. That we were operating at the behest of Israel to divide Arab states, to weaken them so that Israel can become imperial and powerful. The famous document I put out, the Clean Break, which is a quote, a blueprint for conquering and dividing the Arab world, and Israel controls America. Anybody really reads it, sees it's the inverse. It's how the United States is basically telling Israel, stop being so dependent. You have an opportunity here to become a useful asset to the Americans rather than just an albatross. Take the opportunity, pursue strategic choices in the region that make you strong because it helps us. Don't, it was written from an American perspective. How can you help us? So if you read it, you see that it was inverted. But more than that, overall, this whole idea that we were operating as agents of Ahmed Chalabi or that we're trying to divide Iraq. Uh, Look, we were neocons, many of them, many of us grew up in the Cold War. Many of us were Jewish, and we were at the forefront, the neocons, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, of trying to defeat the Soviet Union. And at the core of that was that communism was not the popular representation of the people of Europe. It was it was a tyrannical imposed system. And that therefore people power and the people are what you need to liberate from their government. Precisely because we were Jewish and we were concerned with being seen to be pro-Israeli, we actually did this to show we weren't just concerned with Israeli interests. We were concerned as well, like we were with the Eastern Europeans, we were concerned with the freedom of the people who live in the region. It was a genuine concern. And I know that's hard for many people to grasp, but it was genuine. We literally transplanted what we had done in Eastern Europe, and we're trying to. It was the filters through which we understood the region. If we could just remove these horrible tyrannical regimes and allow Arabs finally to have freedom, then they would develop structures of responsibility, of basically condominium, of tolerance, etc. And freedom, not necessarily democracy at the beginning. There was an internal debate. I'm not a big fan of democracy. I'm much more of a fan of freedom because I think democracy is the final act of freedom, not the first, because democracy can also be mob rule. You can just have a majority, 51% of the people decide they're going to execute the 49%. So to me, freedom is more important and it's first. I say all that because if all this other stuff about Iraq didn't matter. It was strategic. It had all these things. The weapons of mass destruction weren't even what the neocons were focused on. They were that was actually Colin Powell and that group, because they felt if we go to war, it has to be legitimized through the UN. We didn't particularly care about the UN. We thought that the violations of the human rights clauses of the ceasefire from 1992, 91, legitimized a resumption of the war. Congress had already passed resolutions to that effect before. We thought we were fully legitimate to go to war. We didn't need a UN resolution again. So for us, we didn't need a hook. We didn't need the UN to say that there were weapons of mass destruction. So for us, the weapons of mass destruction were theoretical. This guy's dangerous. He wants to have them. Eventually, he'll get them because we're going to lose our will and we're going to lose our way and we're going to let them have them eventually. So it's better to stop them now. But that's not the main thing. And I think it got inverted because we focused on the UN. But that was we've never gotten out there and defended ourselves on that, and that's part of the reason.
The, the late, and I should say, just put I have, if we're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, I have personally, I don't know what we were doing in Afghanistan. I mean, okay, I kind of agree with the Trump thing of just keep the air base. Like I don't know what we were doing for 10 years playing whack-a-mole with the, fighting the Taliban while they can hide in Pakistan. I mean, it's just, it seemed a little crazy. I'm not sure what was gotten out of that. But I want to mention the late Christopher Hitchens. I remember, to your point, he once said of Paul Wolfowitz, he said, I'm going to paraphrase, that there's very few people in D.C. who stay awake at night worried about human rights abuses in Iraq. and Paul Wolfowitz is one of those people. There
Yeah.
was this real concern. I wonder, did you read Steve Cole's new book on Saddam, The Achilles Trap?
No, I haven't yet. Sorry.
Oh, he got the audio
As
of
a
all this.
Washingtonian, I should never admit I didn't read
Yeah,
something, but I did
he.
not read it.
I gotta send you these clips because he got the audio of all Saddam's meetings, and the stuff in it is amazing. Like Saddam would say to people, "I swear on your mustache." But do you know that what Saddam was doing most of his days before the Iraq War? He was writing these novels.
Yeah.
Have you heard about his
Wow.
novels?
No, I haven't.
Oh,
Wow.
can I just tell you this? They're all allegories where one character represents like Israel and the Jews, and one is America and one's Iraq. And he was a total anti-Semite, believed the protocols the elders signed was real.
Yeah.
But he would put these ridiculous anti-Semitic themes in all of his novels. So in his first one, the king kicks out a Jew out of the country. Everybody stands up and applauds. And then his final book, he has these three brothers represent the three Abrahamic faiths. And the Jewish one is named Haskell. And he literally has this character like pray to gold coins in a barn. You know, I mean, that's what he was doing. Anyways, you should read that book.
Wow. He was a tortured soul for sure.
Last thing, I want your acting critique. All right, I'm just going to play this. I want to get your notes on the portrayal of Dick Cheney here. Okay.
All right, let's get this thing underway.
Scooter, why don't you let everyone know the lay of the land?
Of course, as you all know, I am Scooter Libby, Dick's chief of staff. I'm also his national security advisor and a special advisor to the president.
Technically, Scooter outranks any of Bush's people.
Mary Madeline will serve as counselor to the VP and assistant to Bush. David Addington, Dick's main legal counsel, will play center field on all matters relating to executive power. The president has Alberto Gonzalez, Karl Rove, Karen Hughes as his team. Quite frankly, Gonzalez has no clue. Rove is a hack. Hughes should be in AA ball. So we will have fairly unobstructed access to the Oval Office. We will be automatically BCC'd on all emails that the president receives or sends, as well as have access to his schedule the second that it is set or changed.
We will also be receiving the daily intelligence briefing before the president. That gets us inside the decision curve.
Which will actually be
First of all, how did Christian Bale do?
I don't know if he did that. He played Scooter. That's not really.
No. Christian Bale's playing Cheney there.
That probably somewhat like Cheney. I mean, you know, it was somewhat convincing, but Cheney didn't say much in this clip.
You haven't seen Vice?
I've seen Vice. Is that the one with? This was the one by Asner or something. Was it the one with? I forgot. What is his name? Dreyfus playing it. What?
Oh no, I think you're thinking of W by Oliver Stone. Yeah, that was
maybe I don't know.
Oh, you haven't seen
Vice? No, I don't believe I've seen Vice.
It's all about Cheney.
Yeah, I know. Well, but you know, I know what I saw. Not.
Well, so, what did you think of that scene?
It is. It reflects a lack of access and knowledge of what really was and who these people were. The acting was done well. Addington looks like Addington. Madeline kind of looks like Mary Madeline. Scooter doesn't quite look like Scooter. And Cheney does look like Cheney. I mean, the acting was superb, but the content, you know, when I got into the vice president's office, the first thing we were told is two things. Remember two things. One is we're the bridesmaid, we're not the bride. Number one. And number two, while yes, we have access to the intelligence, we don't have direct access to the president. That goes through Cheney, number one. And number two, and through Scooter to some extent, because Scooter was a senior, but the senior advisor and the national security advisor of the vice president, the protocol issue, and it was in many other administrations. You have to remember, Cheney is the second highest elected official in the land. That is not an insignificant fact. He is the only other official in the U.S. government that was elected in the executive branch, that it was elected to the position he holds. He has the mandate of the American people. That makes him inherently the second most powerful person if he does not exercise it or so. But that said, he said, first of all, remember we're the bridesmaid and not the bride. Two, despite our access to policy, always remember the 80% rule. If the policy is 80% what we as a group agree with, don't worry about the 20%. Let it go. Don't fight stupid fights. Only if you think that the policy is way off the rails, is fundamentally flawed, say something. Then say something. Say something in your emails to the National Security Council, so forth. But your job ultimately is advisory, because this is point 3. There's no bureaucracy to the vice president's office. When you were the national security advisor, when you were like me, that senior advisor on Middle East affairs, you had nobody working for you. Nobody. Your job was to be an advisor to the National Security Council and tell them what you thought and what the vice president thought, and maintain his policy, the vice president's policy. And then the National Security Council, based on the president, what was worked out between him, the president, Connie, whatever, they do what they do. They have bureaucracy. They're the ones who command, who writes the papers. For example, okay, we decided something, you, State Department, you take a first cut at the policy paper. They're the ones who manage the show. The Security Council was the ones who make sure that the political echelon of the US government's will is implemented, because the political echelon is the embodiment of the American people, not the bureaucracy. 2, that policy is run in an efficient, effective manner. In other words, managers. And 3, to orchestrate the bureaucracies, a mobilization for a policy. And 4, to convene meetings where the bureaucratic heads meet to set policy. So that was what the Security Council did. All we could do is weigh in. That's it. If we couldn't convince anybody, we had that much power.
But is it true that the Cheney people were sort of pros compared to like a Karen Hughes, some of the Bush people?
No, look, Karen Hughes I don't think she was where she should have been, because foreign policy was not her deal. But Karen Hughes could run political circles around any of us. So could Karl Rove. Look, Condoleezza Rice was the most trusted advisor to the president. Through her, Steve Hadley was the second most trusted. The president in the first term, much less after the election cycle began of the second term, not even after the election, before, in the election cycle, because they were each campaigning and they were in different cities all the time. The vice president's role was to counsel the president, to give him advice. That was it. The real core was Condi and Steve Hadley, and they had their structures. They had their ways of dealing with it. There was an inner circle. They didn't particularly like criticism. Cheney, on the other hand, you could tell him, and I did this in a couple memos. I remember going home that night and telling my wife, I'm going to get fired tomorrow, because my memo was a doozy. We are way off the rails. Our policy, and by the way, our policy, the vice president's office, I don't think we're doing it right. And to give Cheney credit, he would look at it, and more often than not, he'd say, you may be right. He was willing to change his mind if he felt that there was a good argument there. But again, there was an inner circle around the president, and Karl Rove was in the inner circle with Condi. So was Steve Hadley. So were some of the people on the National Security Council. So was some of the other echelons in the White House. Even on Iraq policy, there was a very narrow group surrounding Megan O'Sullivan, Dan Senor, who really were the power, not us. Even though we had a lot of expertise on Iraq and a lot of expertise on Shiism and Iran, we could only advise.
You should really see Vice. It's much better than Oliver Stone's
Yeah,
W.
I'll look at it.
The movie, if you're not aware, it claims basically a focus group. I mean, I have the scene right here if you want to see how they say the war was started.
No, it's okay.
Okay, I'll show. Yeah, and don't you want to see the actor that played you? They got
I'm in
Brad
it?
Pitt. No, you're not in. I'm joking.
Yeah, I did. I didn't think I was.
But this is how they say the war came about.
Someone up.
Got it. Mark, there's really strong feelings coming from Mark. I'm interested. Does anybody else feel the same? Or
They understand we're at war, but they don't know against who.
They want a country. It's cleaner, simpler.
That would certainly help us legally.
Well, looks like it's time to take Iraq.
It is about goddamn time.
It's called the Office of Special Plans. Tenet is not yet serious enough without the threat that Saddam poses, a global war on terror. But I can promise you that this intelligence group will be.
Wolfie, I got something.
Transmissions. If there's a donkey with a radio up its ass, I want to know what it's transmitting.
Oh, maybe you are in here. Actually, I'm wrong. Sorry. Briefly.
You want to take that motherfucker Saddam down for a long time.
Here's a report that says Mohammed Atta, one of the 9/11 hijackers, may have met with an Iraqi spy in Prague.
It's a really strong statement. Does anybody agree with that statement?
Wait a minute, we can't just bump people.
Oh.
Yeah, no.
It's from Czech intelligence, and they question its credibility.
I've been to Prague. They question everything.
Who wants to be an anonymous source?
Make sure you work in the phrase, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. That focus group through the roof.
There will always be uncertainty about when he will acquire nuclear weapons. But we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
There is a smoking gun or a mushroom cloud.
Simply
We have waited
stated,
too long.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has
You
weapons of
actually
mass
might be
destruction.
in this briefly.
There's no doubt he's amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
When Saddam creates and uses nuclear weapons, what will we tell the American people?
Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare.
To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk.
When expect a UN resolution authorizing the war against Iraq. So tonight we'll go on
hopes of an oppressed people have spoken.
No, I mean, it's great fiction, but it's fiction. Nothing of that really resembles anything. I can tell you where Special Plans came from. It was September 11th at night. I went down to the Pentagon. I had been a Naval Reserve intelligence officer and still had all my passes to get into the building. So a guy called me in who worked for Doug Feith. And I went to his office and he said, "Come back tomorrow morning. We got something we got to talk about." And I went there the next morning. It was still burning. It was terrible. And they said, "Do you still have your clearances?" And I said, "Well, my clearances are still there, but I retired from the military 6 months ago. I went individual ready retirement, IRR. So the clearances are still active, but I don't have. I mean, my security clearance is active, but my access is not. The passwords on the computers and stuff are gone because I retired." So they said, "Is there a way you could resume that? We might have something for you to do." And I said, "Well, you have to talk to the head of DIA, CIA, et cetera, because they're the ones who control the access." And they organized it, and I got my clearances back, and I started as a contractor. They had the option maybe of calling me up because I was individual ready reserve, but they instead made me a civilian contractor or consultant or whatever they called it. And I remember I said, what is my mission?" And I remember Doug Feith and Paul Wolfowitz looking at me and saying, "I don't know. You'll figure it out." We've just been hit. We don't even know who hit us. Go figure it out. Figure this out. So I was all dejected and I was like, what do I do here? And I went over Richard Pearl's house. And he was on the Defense Policy Board and mentor to Doug Feith and a close friend of Paul's. And because he was on the Defense Policy Board, he was aware of what I was going to do. And I said, Richard, what do I do? And he said, listen, when there's a big snowstorm and a whole bunch of people, thousands of people are socked in an airport, do you ever notice how eventually the musicians find the musicians and the professors of literature find the professors of literature and the physicists find the physicists? Everybody seems to find and they spend the time networking. We don't know what hit us. Wade into the world of terrorism and figure it out that way. So I went in the next day. I asked for a room. I got a room. I asked for a lot of paper. I had full access to all the intelligence. And it was like the movie A Beautiful Mind. I don't know if you remember that movie where the guy went crazy trying to find UFOs. Except what I was doing was I'd have a piece of intelligence and I'd see a name and I'd put a dot and put the serial number of the intelligence. Then I'd see he traveled to, I don't know, Rome. And he stayed in a safe house of X organization. X organization was the next dot, a line. And what began to develop on my walls with very tiny writing was this vast universe. It looked like the solar system with thicker lines, thinner lines. And what you could see is the world network of terrorism developing in front of your eyes. Who was interacting with whom? And you realized a couple things. One is nobody is ever fully loyal to anybody. But two, there are some state patterns. They change over time. But there are some state patterns that sort of match when these things would happen. And it just meant that the state was in interaction with that terrorist group and knew how to use them. But there were a couple very clear things. Sunnis worked with Shiites, secular worked with religious. The various key assumptions that had governed American policy were flawed. And they clouded our ability to understand what hit us. And so I started developing a PowerPoint projection to capture the main ideas. What I turned in, and this became the foundation for the Office of Special Plans. This was, quote, the Rogue Intelligence Operation. This was really called Special Policy Unit or something like that, which then became Special Plans. But what emerged from that was a 150-page PowerPoint, of which two pages tied in some form to the Iraqi government. 2 out of 150. 17, if I remember correctly, tied to Iran. If anything, Iran should have been the target, not Iraq. It did not produce a justification for Iraq. Did the Iraqi government know? I don't even know if they knew. Were they involved with terrorist groups that might have known and had some tangential or even partially more than tangential role? There seemed to be a little bit. Iran, same, much more. These terrorists interacted. You had Al-Qaeda staying with Abu Nidal. Al-Qaeda being, the arch Islamist terror, Abu Nidal being a communist. So you saw the interaction. So of course you were going to see everybody interacting with anybody. You saw a real evil swamp, a hydra of carnage, so to speak. And it was employable by various governments when they needed pieces of it. So that sort of led much more to the larger idea that we've got a bigger problem of the politics of the region, where the tyranny and the corruption and the evil, essentially, of these governments who suppress their people needed these structures to export their internal violence, to export their internal problems, to unify around the cause to justify their internal crushing. So if anything, it justified more the concept ultimately. It justified the concept ultimately of maybe the war for freedom. But did it drive us into Iraq? Absolutely not. We weren't cynical at all. There was no focus groups. There was no, oh, let's message it this way, blah, blah, blah. There was a genuine strategic concern for what had just hit us, and that we needed to deal with this problem, because if it isn't Iraq tomorrow, it would be Iran the next day, or Libya, or Syria, that we had paid enough of a price over too many years for the overflow of the violence of internal Arab politics, and that we have to now change the paradigm and change the whole way we do business.
So just for the 9/11 truthers, you and Dov Zakheim were not sitting in a room controlling the airplanes. It wasn't an inside job. Is that what are you saying?
No.
That Dov Zakheim was not running 9/11? Is that?
Look, I mean, they keep saying, when the Jews left the building ahead of time. Do you realize the disproportionate number of Jews who were killed on 9/11? I mean, exactly the amount of Jews you would expect to be killed who worked in those buildings were killed. It's just unreal. By the way, the Israelis did not like what we were doing either. The Israelis felt, they were like, why are you focused on Iraq? Why are you guys doing this stuff? You should be focused on Iran. Believe me, we did not have the support of the Israeli government. If anything, there was a lot of tension between us, the special plans, and then I left into the State Department shortly thereafter. And the special plans continued under Abe Shulsky, and the names were correct. But believe me, we were not liked by the Israelis in any shape or form.
Have you watched any of these 9/11 truth documentaries, like Loose Change?
No. I saw what the intelligence. I mean, we know who Al Qaeda was. I mean, it was very clear. I saw the intelligence.
No, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just curious.
No, I just can't. I mean, I know the conspiracy theories. If you treat them as fiction, they're fun. And I'll go see the movie you just showed me, even if I know it's wrong, because it's entertaining. I watch West Wing, even though that's not a very good representation. But just like doctors watched ER when it was around, they knew it wasn't quite.
I see Richard Pearl is still alive, so future episode idea. I want you, Richard Pearl, and we can watch a 9/11 truth documentary.
That would be. But look, I mean, it's entertaining. But at the end of the day,
it's dangerous.
We were hit by what it's. What you see is what we got. That it's pretty much straightforward. Who Al Qaeda was and who they worked with and what they represent, and larger questions, that's still something that really deserves some more analysis and attention. But what you see is what you got. I was as surprised as everybody that morning. I was sitting in my bedroom getting ready to go downtown to my office. I was still not in government yet. And my wife said, come up here, something's happened, terrible. I go up, I see on the TV that there's a burning tower. She said, a plane flew into it. And I looked at it and I said, that's not a small plane. That's not an accident. That's a big commercial airliner flew into that. That doesn't just happen. Not the World Trade Center. I mean, So I was instantly thinking, this is hanky-panky. Maybe somebody committed suicide, etc. And then the second one is we're watching hit. And I was like, well, 2 planes. That somebody's attacking us. So for me, it was so instantly I thought, you know what? I'm going to be called up. I might as well preempt it. I'm just going to put on my uniform, going to go down. I know I'm going to be called up. So what's the point of waiting? So I put on my uniform. I start walking down the steps. And my wife says, you got to come back up here. You can't go. And I said, why? Because the Pentagon's been hit. And this is where rationality flees. I looked at her and said, no, that can't be. I'm headed to the Pentagon. How can it be hit? As if rationality, it's whatever. Believe me, it was as surprising for all of us as it was for every American. Yeah, and it's depressing and it's horrifying.
I'll just summarize. It's funny what happened with the 9/11 Truth Movement, so-called 9/11 Truth Movement, in quotations. First, it started out with Bush let it happen, but the planes were real. A few years later, it was there were no planes. It was a directed energy attack. Then there was a big civil war between they would call each other the no planers and the planers, and there's a then it got more evolved. It was I looked up one last night. I was looking for something, and it got more sophisticated. It was actually they had the missile hit that part of the Pentagon because those people were looking for the trillions of dollars that the Bush people had stolen. So that they killed the people looking for. It got really creative.
One thing I can just as a rule of thumb say to the truthers, were that the American government were that capable. I think incompetence is always the default to explain almost everything in the U.S. government. I've dealt with too much. It's a huge bureaucracy. There's a lot of people with different interests. Everybody's playing everybody. Go watch some of the Shakespeare plays like Henry V or Richard III, or go see some of the great literature of political, or go read Thucydides or even Suetonius from the Romans. Believe me, it's a mess. It's a horrible, horrible mess. And conspiracies are really difficult because people try to scheme because people are pretty narcissistic and they think they can do it. It's not that people aren't scheming. They get away with anything for real on a large scale, government-wide. It's impossible. Too much incompetence.
Yeah, I mean, that's the flattering aspect of anti-Semitism. They had to... Jews, the Israelis are so amazing. They could do this in another country, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, right after the war, after I left government in 2008, 2009, 2010, I went to New York. I wanted to be a consultant for some firms, for financial firms or so forth. Consulting, doing political work, analyzing the Middle East for them. And one guy obviously was very far to the left, and he was very upset by us going to war in Iraq, and he was saying, you did this, and you did that, and you did this, and you did that, and you got us into this war. And I remember at a certain point, I just couldn't argue with him anymore. It was irrational. And I just looked at him and I said, well, look, I mean, if I'm really that powerful, then you should hire me. I mean, really, if I can make 2 wars happen from a position 4 or 5 levels below the president, then you should hire me. I'm pretty effective. What can you do?
Well, thank you so much for...
Oh, not much, Dan.
You were so generous. And, we disagree on some things, but I always learn a lot from listening to you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was always wonderful. And it's always good to... it's the first time I really had a chance to go over some of this history because everything's a treadmill. We're always dealing with the current. So...
Yes.